hello, friends. Do I have a nerdy little treat for you today? Have you ever heard that you need to create an optimal ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s for good health? Or that you shouldn't eat canola oil because it's inflammatory? You are going to be glued to your earbuds because today's episode is absolutely jam-packed with easy to digest science about oils and fats. It's me, Desiree Nielsen, registered dietitian and your host for the Allsorts podcast, our little journey into evidence-informed wellness to help you break through the misinformation about nutrition, let you shed the dead weight of influencer wellness expectations, and create a life that actually helps you feel well. I couldn't think of a better person to chat with about the science of oils than Dr. Matthew Nagra ND. It's my first time having a repeat guest on the pod. And if you know Dr. Nagra, you'll understand why. He's so good at interpreting the scientific research so that it's easy to digest, 100% pun intended. And we get into all of it today. From whether we need to worry about our omega-3/6 ratio to whether you should pour MCT oil into your coffee, or perhaps even eliminate oils from your diet altogether. Fats are one of those topics in nutrition that is actually super complex and very prone to trend and fashion, from the low-fat 90s to the keto aughts and like literally everything in between. But at their core, like fats are just a nutrient. They are a macronutrient. We have carbohydrates, we have proteins, we have fats. They are interconnected in terms of the fact that when, we lower one in our diet, the other two, or at least another one, tends to increase in its place because there is a balance of these macronutrients in nature, and they have specific biological functions in our bodies. Like we couldn't actually eliminate fat from our life, nor would we want to. Most of us think about fat as a storage form of energy in our body. But fats are actually really important for building cell membranes and even producing hormones. We also eat a lot of other nutrients that are actually fat soluble, which means you need to consume fat alongside them in order to absorb more of them into your bloodstream so they don't just flush on out your GI tract. Like that lycopene in tomatoes, you need fat to absorb it, which is why, Italians love to drizzle a little olive oil over tomatoes. Ditto many of the antioxidant and anti-inflammatory phytochemicals found in plants. Like so much of what we quote as being the power of plant foods actually requires a bit of fat for absorption. And there are also, I have to admit, like a ton of dissenting voices out there. And not just influencers. And I love to sort of rag on that, but it's actually health professionals too, doctors and dietitians and naturopaths. There are a ton of dissenting voices out there on how much and what type of fats to consume. And as someone who got her start in anti-inflammatory nutrition, I have to admit that the prevailing wisdom at the time, which is very much based on mechanistic studies, which we're going to get into what those even are in the rest of the pod. But the idea was that we should minimize, but not eliminate, omega-6 fats from vegetable oils primarily. But as the science evolves, so should we as evidence-based health professionals. And you might actually be surprised to hear what the science says now. So let's get into it. But first, are you eating well, but still need an energy boost? Are you looking for some extra antioxidant support? I love Botanica Health Perfect Greens. Green powders supercharge your healthy foundation with powerful greens that most of us aren't actually eating, like wheatgrass and spirulina, a rich source of antioxidant and anti-inflammatory phytochemicals, as well as B vitamins and minerals like iron to help us feel energized. They're organic, completely free of fillers, and they're super easy to use, even if you don't drink a smoothie in the morning. Just shake with water for a mid-morning energy boost. A huge, huge thank you to Botanica for supporting our work here at the pod. So go show them a little bit of love at www.botanicahealth.com. We've got a lot of learning to do today, folks, so let's dive in. Okay, this is super fun and also super weird. We are here live on the CHFA West show floor. And for you, those of you who have not heard of CHFA West before, it is the Canadian Health Food Association trade show. So like all your favorite brands, all the favorite things you love to eat and drink, we are like smack dab in the middle of it. And I am smack dab in the middle of it with Dr. Matthew Nagra, my very, very favorite naturopathic doctor. And we are going to talk about a super hot topic in the plant-based world, oils. What are their health benefits? Are there negative associations with consuming oils? Why do we talk about no oil in the plant-based community? All of those things and much, much more. So I want to start by, because we're here at the CHFA, in sort of like product candy land. I know you've only had a chance to visit a couple of aisles. Have you seen anything that sparked your interest? Or is there just anything that you're like really loving to eat or drink right now?
Yeah, thanks for having me. As far as things I'm really loving at the moment, I actually tried the Zevia drink, the root beer. I love root beer. Haven't really had it in a long time, but it's always nice to try that. And then I like seeing all the vegan products around too, just seeing how it's really picked up steam the last few years. So definitely excited to try some of those afterwards.
Yeah, Zevia, my oldest, because we don't really drink soda. Like it's like a special occasion. You go to a restaurant and they have their fancy drink, which is a little bit soda, but they just discovered Zevia and they're like, Mom, can I have this? And I was like, we can have this every once in a while. It's just stevia. There's like not a lot of sugar. It won't like send you cascading around the room. So yeah, like Zevia is like their new favorite thing. So I love that. So one of the things that I love so much about you is just your absolute commitment to really digging in to the current scientific literature and being really unbiased and critical about like, what are some of the things we talk about in nutrition? Where is this science at? Where is this coming from? What does the literature say now? Because maybe we're talking about things that seemed true 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but where is the literature now? And so I'm really thrilled to have you here to talk about oils, which very much remains a concept of significant controversy in nutrition, but specifically in the plant-based community, particularly because there are several prominent health professionals who advocate for a no oil and or a low-fat diet. So could we start by talking about the theory behind why plant oils aren't good for you?
Yeah, so the concerns around oils in general in the plant-based community, now there are other sort of diet camps that might demonize certain types of oils, but are okay with other types. But in the plant-based community, there's a large proportion of individuals who just outright say that we shouldn't consume oils. That largely stems from a couple trials. One of them, they had individuals consume a lot of oil, even olive oil. We're talking, quarter cup, even more at one time with bread on top of that, and saw that in the short term, their arteries weren't able to dilate as well as they may otherwise have been, or especially prior to that meal. Now, is that super relevant to health outcomes, actual risk of disease? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit, but that's one of the pieces of that picture. The other part largely comes from a couple trials, or one of them's a case series. One of them was a trial conducted by, again, some of the prominent individuals in the plant-based community, where they put people on very low-fat plant-based diets and saw improvements in their risk of cardiovascular disease. Of course, there are a lot of other things going on there. It's not just like they removed oil from the diet. They also increased plant foods. Some of them had them exercise and quit smoking if they were. And there's all sorts of other variables there. But because that low fat aspect was a part of the picture, a lot of individuals just assumed that that was responsible, when actually they might have even done better with it. I mean, we could certainly speculate that way.
That's so interesting to me. And particularly when we're talking about like chronic disease support and management, because one of the things that I always hold for folks as I'm educating about nutrition is that what we do to maintain a healthy body can sometimes look different than what we do to bring a body back into health. And so I do think it's really interesting that it stemmed from sort of the cardiovascular disease and trying to bring people back into health. But then we sort of apply it to like, okay, let's talk about this for everyone. Now, because you talked about the fact that these were a couple of older studies, like where is the research now in 2022? Do we have research to corroborate this? Is the research pointing to something different? Like, where do you think the research is at right now?
I would actually say that we have some pretty old research that is very positive with regard to oils, whether that be vegetable oils or olive oil. I don't know if you want to separate the two and probably talk about that at some point. But as of right now, if we're to focus specifically on olive oil, which I think is the one that most diet camps agree is healthy, or at least healthier, we have a recent study that came out in January of this year. This was from the Nurses Health Study, the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study out of Harvard. And they were looking at tens of thousands of individuals. Actually, it was over 100,000, I believe, total. And they looked at olive oil consumption. And those consuming the most olive oil, which was over half a tablespoon a day, so not even a ton, versus those consuming the least, which was, I think, a couple grams a day or something. It was a very low amount. We saw a 19% reduction in risk of all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. So that's death due to all causes during the study, or dying of cardiovascular disease during the study, while also seeing a lower risk of dying of neurodegenerative illnesses, respiratory diseases. It was really incredible. Now, some individuals might say, well, that's compared to what? Were they just replacing garbage foods and seeing a benefit that way? And okay, that's fair. But they actually went further and did what's called a substitution analysis. And it really paints a bit of a picture as to why we're seeing benefits. When they're replacing saturated fat-rich foods like butter, we see a clear benefit. When they're replacing other sorts of vegetable oils, it's a pretty neutral shift overall. But then they actually found that replacing mayonnaise or margarines, there was, again, a benefit there. Now, margarines, when this study started, had trans fats in them. That's probably the issue there. And if we look at mayonnaise, they have eggs, they have all sorts of other things in there. That's probably why we see that shift. So in a sense, I'd say they're somewhat correct that you're replacing worse foods like butter and so on seem to confer benefit, while replacing other potentially healthy foods, which we'll get to, again, vegetable oils, was a relatively neutral shift. But they also adjusted for diet quality. So regardless of diet quality, whether you had a good diet or a poorer diet, we still saw benefit with olive oil consumption. So it's pretty strong evidence in my view. And that's just one piece of the puzzle. It's one of the more recent pieces of the puzzle. We have a lot of other data to support that as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, the more I sort of maybe I'm just getting old, but the more I sort of walk through nutrition and, we're always paying attention to the research. But I do sort of get the sense that the less we mess with our diet, the more we look to, global traditional diets. How did they eat? Let's not talk paleo. We're going to talk about modern traditional diets. But I mean, many traditional foodways do contain oils. And so we're seeing this rapid increase in chronic disease over the last, 25, 30 years. And it's not that we have, consumed these traditional oils in the way that we always have, but it's the vast increase in hyper processed foodstuffs and fried foods and all of those kind of things. So I'm always, for me, I think I'm getting a little bit less just do it feels good. And also I have a really big bias. I'm a massive extra virgin olive oil fan. I cook a lot with it. It's a huge part of my diet. But I would love to talk a little bit about what are the health benefits of fat and what roles do fat actually play in human nutrition? Because I think in order to sort of start to separate this conversation between oils and fat in general, we have to know, do we need fat? What does fat do in the body?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty big question because there are so many different types of fats. If we're talking about olive oil, they're rich in a type of fat called monounsaturated fat. And these fats can lower cholesterol levels. They're really good in that respect. And then there are polyunsaturated fats, which are more rich in, say, vegetable oils, nuts, and seeds. And those are probably actually the best ones for cardiovascular risk overall, and especially for lowering cholesterol levels, which then translates into a lower cardiovascular risk. And then there are saturated fats, which do the opposite. They can raise our LDL cholesterol levels, increase risk of cardiovascular disease. And then there's trans fats, which I think everybody agrees are harmful nowadays, which is why they've been made illegal, at least to include them in foods in certain parts of the world. I don't know if that's the same in every country. Now, within that realm of, say, polyunsaturated fats I mentioned, there are some essential fatty acids. These are fats that we need to consume in our diet for proper functioning. There's linoleic acid, which is the primary omega-6 fat. And that's, again, very rich in vegetable oils, very rich in nuts and seeds. And then if we look at alpha-linolenic acid, which is the primary omega-3 fat that we're going to get in our diet, at least unless you're eating a ton of seafood. That's found, again, in certain seeds like flax seeds or nuts like walnuts. And that has really important benefits for, say, cardiovascular risk, possibly even for cognitive function. And we can convert that into longer chain omega-3s that you would typically get from fish, or if you're like us and don't eat fish, you can get from a supplement or just up your ALA intake. So there are some important fats to include. I think excluding them altogether could potentially even be detrimental. And given that polyunsaturated fats have the best or biggest effect on our cardiovascular risk compared to other types of fats or even carbohydrates, I think reducing them, like we've seen in some of that older research I mentioned, might even be detrimental with respect to cardiovascular risk compared to if you were eating more. So it's, I think, fair to even speculate the results could have been even better had they increased their polyunsaturated fat intake.
And, I think that's a really important point you make about polyunsaturates, because you are lumping together omega-3s and omega-6s. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute, because I really want to dive into that question. But one of the things I think, particularly with fats too, like from my world, from like gut health and the gut microbiome, is that, we have some really interesting data, particularly around saturated fats. And I think this is an important conversation to have because oh gosh, whatever that Time cover was like in the mid 2000s. Yeah. And like fat is back. And it was like a stack of like steak and butter and cheese. The world rejoices because there was like some interesting data coming out of like the team from Harvard School of Public Health saying maybe saturated fat isn't as directly linked to cardiovascular disease. But I think, now that we've come through that, I think actually the data really does support that saturated fat is not what it should be. And from the microbiome perspective, we know that high fats and particularly saturated fat diets can actually augment the gut microbiome in a really negative fashion. And then the other really interesting thing, particularly from my world, because in our practice, we work with so many people with like chronic inflammatory concerns, digestive concerns, autoimmunity, is that when you increase a significant amount of fat in the diet, particularly saturated fat, you have an increase in the chylomicrons that our body makes in order to digest and absorb these fats. And from the microbiome perspective, chylomicrons are really important because they get the fat from the watery environment of your gut and usher it into your circulation. But those chylomicrons can also pick up bacterial fragments known as lipopolysaccharides that are associated with inflammatory response in the gut-based immune system. So I think it's really funny that, now we're still in this persistent message that like, saturated fats aren't bad for you anymore, when really the data is like, actually, we should, whenever possible, be striving to replace saturated fats in our diet with plant-based fats, all fats, the monounsaturated fats, which are definitely like the least controversial fats that we have, but also the polyunsaturated fats. And that's not just the omega-3, but the omega-6. And that's something that's really changed in my understanding from when I started out, really talking about inflammation and like the lab data that we had back then. And that's really changed based on the human clinical trials over the last decade. I want to talk again specifically about extra virgin olive oil. So you mentioned that it is a monounsaturated fat. And it does seem to be the one fat that in the literature has really been focused on as like the potential for health benefits. Now, you mentioned in that other trial that when you look at like comparisons, so swapping extra virgin olive oil over other plant oils, maybe the benefit isn't as clear. So do you think we overstate the benefits of extra virgin olive oil?
So going back to that study I mentioned, they didn't specify extra virgin olive oil. That these were oils that health professionals, so the people included in the study were health professionals. These are just the oils that they were consuming. I'm sure some of it was extra virgin, some of it was probably regular olive oil. We can't really delineate there. Now, between that, there wasn't really a shift. And if anything, they actually favored probably vegetable oils for cardiovascular risk over the olive oil. With extra virgin olive oil, I think there are potential for other benefits. There's the high polyphenol content potentially helping with cardiovascular risk or other outcomes, cognitive outcomes in particular. So when we look at trials, like shorter term trials on extra virgin olive oil and markers of disease or potentially outcomes like, again, cognitive outcomes, we do see a benefit there. I suspect that if you were to directly compare extra virgin olive oil to, say, a canola oil or something, it'd probably still be relatively similar for cardiovascular outcomes, potentially better for neurological outcomes. I can't really say for sure. I don't think we have that hard outcome data. But yeah, overall, I think it's pretty, like we have a pretty good reason to believe that it is a healthy overall oil.
And I love that you said canola oil, because I think it's a really excellent segue into this next topic, because we are currently sitting in a space where you probably will not find a speck of canola oil. If there is, it is expeller pressed and organic. And the reason for that is that, this culture of wellness has sort of built up a really strong mythology around canola oil, that it is inflammatory because of the omega-6 fatty acids, that it's oxidized and poor quality. And so I would love to talk about omega-3s versus omega-6s. You mentioned already that these are essential fatty acids, essential meaning we cannot make them. We must consume them from our diet. And I think that folks forget that omega-6s are also essential. Like we need them. And I've had a lot of conversations with folks who are like, oh, well, what about eating nuts and seeds? Because they have omega-6. Like, isn't that inflammatory? Isn't that bad for us? So can you take us a little bit about like, let's talk about the pathways of omega-3s and omega-6s. And should we be nervous about consuming omega-6? What is your advice around these oils?
Yeah, so the concerns over, say, omega-6 rich foods is that they work along this pathway from, say, linoleic acid that we'll find in vegetable oils or nuts and seeds into what's called arachidonic acid, which is potentially inflammatory. Now, the enzyme that they compete with or that they use for that process competes with alpha linolenic acid, which converts into EPA and DHA, those longer omega-3s. And there's controversy around, oh, if you eat too much omega-6, is that going to crowd out the omega-3 from using the enzyme and so on? But at the end of the day, when we look at the so-called ratio, the ideal ratio, which everybody cites, usually somewhere in the ballpark of 4-to-1 or something like that, we actually don't see that the ratio matters all that much. What matters more is the absolute amounts. If you're consuming enough omega-3s to hit your targets, it doesn't really matter if you increase your omega-6. It has a pretty small impact on the overall conversion rates. So that's one issue out. Now, as far as the inflammation picture and say arachidonic acid, we have a lot of trials. In fact, we have meta-analyses of trials looking at omega-6 consumption and whether or not it converts into the arachidonic acid. And we don't really see that. And on top of that, we don't see it increase inflammatory markers in humans. I think this is a really good point to just mention that a lot of these concerns I mentioned, whether it be the oil consumption and that short-term artery function, or whether it be the potential for this fat to turn into an inflammatory compound, these are what we call mechanisms. These are things that warrant further study that might translate into something we can use to improve our health, but we ultimately have to study them in humans to see if that effect happens. And when we do that, it doesn't. And that's really important because, for example, if we look at all of the mechanisms that made it to phase 1 clinical trials for FDA approval. So these are even the mechanisms that were good enough to get the funding to do that. So this is probably overstating the number. Only 6.9% of them actually make it through approval. That means that the vast, vast, vast majority of time, these fail. These mechanisms do not pan out. So that's why it's really important to just hedge your bets a little bit, to step back and say, okay, this is a potential mechanism. We need to look at it further. But what actually happens in humans when we eat this food or we feed a group of people this food? And that's really what matters. And when we look at that, we don't see any concern.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think, it's really interesting because in this wellness space, like there's a lot of folks citing a lot of science. And I think you've just given something really important for everyone to think about because they're like, oh, there's a study. And so folks don't always realize that this one study was not done in humans. And even if we have one in humans, like we can pretty much, like if we roll the dice on PubMed, you can typically find like one study in your favor for almost any statement that you're going to make about human nutrition. And so the idea is really to look at these, look at the research over time, understand like, what does this mean in the context of the human diet as well? Because when I see folks, consuming a plant milk, for example, and they're like, oh, I'm not going to take that plant milk because there is like a little bit of sunflower oil or canola oil, when in all honesty, there's 500 milligrams if you're lucky. And then they say, oh, so you should drink like full fat dairy milk instead. We really miss the forest for the trees when we're making our individual nutrition choices. And, one of the things that I say like again and again till I'm blue in the face is pattern over plate. And like, what is the pattern? Like, where are the whole plant? If you are eating mostly whole plant foods, if you are, reducing your intake of animal foods, particularly saturated fats from those animal foods, like you are going to be okay. Like the folks who go the gluten-free, like gluten-free, vegan, low sugar, everything, but their diet still mostly consists of boxes and bags of things that are like quote unquote clean ingredients. that's still not going to be the same thing for your health as like actually just eating the plants.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point with contradictory research. So everyone throws this out there that, oh, there's a contradictory study saying this, therefore the jury's out. We don't know. When you can still have consensus with a couple outliers, that that doesn't throw out consensus. If that's the case, then there are certainly studies that don't find an association between smoking and lung cancer. Does not mean that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer. In fact, there was a meta-analysis from a few years back of like hundreds of studies. It was one of the most massive, probably the largest meta-analysis I've ever seen in my life. And there were a handful of studies that didn't pick up on an association between smoking and lung cancer, right? So the thing is, there's a lot of nuance within science, and especially within the nutrition science, that most of the time, these contradictory findings are explained by that. For example, saturated fat you mentioned earlier. The reason that some studies don't pick up on an association between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease is because they're usually comparing populations that eat a lot of saturated fat to populations who eat even more. There's a plateau effect. It doesn't continue to raise risk forever. Eventually you'd hit 100%, So that's one issue. Another one is they do these sorts of analyses where they adjust for what we call the mediator. So if saturated fat raises your cholesterol levels and higher cholesterol levels cause cardiovascular disease, but you only compare people with similar cholesterol levels, you're never going to find an association, right? If A leads to B, B leads to C, but you just remove B from the equation, no, of course you're not going to find an association. So I've almost never actually seen a study where the contradictory results were not explainable by something going on within the study. It's almost always explainable unless the study actually has missing data, which often happens where, you don't have enough background diet data to know what they're replacing or what's going on there. I mean, that happens sometimes, but yeah, really, there just isn't controversy over most of these things.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's also so important for folks not to sort of put the burden of placing this research into context on themselves. Like, it's why I love what you put out there on your Instagram, like everything. You place the study into context. Like, here's what the study says, here's what we know, and here's how we can interpret this study based on what else we've seen in the literature. And, podcasts like Plant Proof and like Huberman Lab, like they really get into the nitty gritty of where is this research coming from? Is it out of left field? Like, what does it mean vis-a-vis like the last decade of research? And I think we want to try and do it all and understand it all. And like, it's okay to be like, you know what? I know the law inside and out. And for nutrition, I'm actually going to go to Dr. Nagra and like see what he says about the research, because I trust him to actually interpret this science for me. I don't need to be like the bearer of all things. I want to talk to you a little bit about like your own sort of like personal interactions with like fats and oils in your diet, because I know that everyone loves to know. It's like, here's the research, but like, what do you actually do? And from me from my perspective, like how I love to cook, how I love to eat, and also as a dietitian, I think that fat plays a really important role in the diet, not just from a nutritional perspective, because it helps to absorb fat soluble vitamins, A, D, E, K, but also many of our phytochemicals in our food are fat soluble. So having a little bit of fat in the diet is important. But also as a recipe developer, fat carries flavor. And one of the things that I'm so passionate about in plant-based cooking is that if you are going to make these choices for a healthier body, a healthier planet, to be kinder to animals, you also need to love what you eat for the rest of your life. So my bias is absolutely, I cook with olive oil. We eat avocados, we snack on olives, we love our nut butters and nuts and seeds. Like where do fats fit in your personal diet?
I would say I eat a very boring diet, probably to what most people would expect. Maybe I don't know, but like every morning or almost every morning I have oatmeal. If I don't have oatmeal, I have a smoothie, and in that I pretty much always throw flax seeds. I like to get my omega-3s in right away, get that kind of done and over with. And I sometimes throw in walnuts if I don't have flax, or I throw in some hemp seeds if I'm making a smoothie. So I typically use nuts and seeds there. For lunches, I often will do say tofu sandwich. Tofu is actually a decent source of polyunsaturated fats, especially those omega-6 fats that we were talking about. So I usually do that. I'll fry them up. Sometimes I'll use a little bit of oil, whether that be olive oil or otherwise. Sometimes I'll just use hot sauce to fry it up and just make it really simple. And then for dinners, it really depends on what I make. Say if I'm making a stir fry, I'll use some maybe olive oil or actually I don't have any. I was going to say canola oil. I don't have any at my place right now, but if I did, I'd probably use some of that just to coat the pan and then make a stir fry that way, stir fry some veggies in that. It's there to complement my diet when I want to. It's not like I go out of my way to consume a ton of it or a ton of these overt fats, but I also don't avoid them. I will have plant-based meats every now and then, which often use these fats too. And my partner was visiting for the last month back from school, and I definitely had a fair bit of coconut-based ice cream. So I'm just going to throw that out there, but that's not a regular daily occurrence. That's just, it's a treat that we like to have here and there. And that's not something, especially because of the coconut-based fat is very high in saturated fat, not something I would have every day simply because of the potential for increase in cardiovascular risk. But again, having it here or there as a treat, I see no issue.
And again, it's that placing it into like context of like pattern over plate. Like I eat all of these whole foods. And so, yeah, if it's like a celebratory time and I'm going to eat I'm on vacation, I'm going to eat a bunch of coconut ice cream. And so let's talk about coconut, because there's two sort of like consumer fats that I really want to talk about, if we can call them consumer fats, but we're here at the CHFA. So I feel like that's the like tone. Coconut oil on a plant-based diet, because we do typically take in fewer saturates than someone who consumes meat and dairy. Like there is, it's not something that I consume every day either. Like I have coconut oil in my pantry because sometimes the flavor or the texture just makes sense if I'm making a special thing. But there's a huge trend towards MCT, or medium chain triglycerides, which we find in coconut oil. And in an environment that we're sitting in right now, there's a lot of MCT products. A lot of companies sort of like pushing them as you're like, I don't go out of my way to consume the oils. They say, go out of your way, consume this like jigger of like MCT oil every single day for weight support or metabolism or brain health. But coconut oil is not 100% MCT. Can you talk a little bit about what MCT is and what we know about it, and whether folks should go out of their way to consume MCT gummies?
Yeah, MCT oils, medium chain triglycerides, they are one of the types of saturated fats in coconut, and they do seem to behave differently than other saturated fats. They're absorbed differently, they might be metabolized differently, and they might have a lesser, say, response on our cholesterol levels. The thing is, when we're looking at coconut, as you said, it's not just MCT. It's a whole bunch of different types of saturated fat. MCT is just a portion of it. Now, it's a very reductionist view to say that because it contains this thing, therefore it's A, not harmful, or B, even beneficial. It's the same kind of view I take with individuals who say, oh, well, red meat has iron, therefore red meat is a superfood. I mean, I spoke about that on the Plant Proof podcast too. It's just, you can get those foods from other sources that don't increase your risk of disease. And when that's possible, I think that's a good idea. It's as simple as that. So with coconut, we have data on coconut oil. And it pretty consistently, unless you're comparing it to butter, which I hope we agree isn't the best, it seems to raise your cholesterol levels, your LDL cholesterol, which would raise your cardiovascular risk. We don't have long-term trials looking at rates of actual cardiovascular events in people consuming coconut oil for a long period, but it's also a relatively new sort of phenomenon, I feel. So I'm sure we'll get that at some point. Now, with MCTs, this is kind of a spoiler alert for a post I'm probably going to make at some point, but there is a relatively recent meta-analysis of trials on MCT oils. And overall, they didn't find that MCTs increase our LDL cholesterol levels. But when compared to unsaturated fats, they did, right? So compared to what? It matters. If you're choosing between having MCT oil or an unsaturated fat, whether that be your polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fats, you could be raising your levels. Of course, you don't typically use them in the same way. It's not like you're dumping vegetable oils into your coffee or something. So, I mean, in that sense, it's hard to really tease out how much of an effect it would have. But just generally speaking, compared to healthier fat sources or more heart healthy fat sources, I should say, it does seem to raise your risk.
Yeah, I feel like that's the tweet of this podcast, is like, compared to what? Particularly because when you think about like the keto community, for example, and, you know, as a dietitian, I find keto potentially a really interesting therapeutic tool for folks, a very, 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 like, I'll say very like 30 times, but I'll spare the listener, like a very small amount of people who perhaps with their type 2 diabetes, they just have not responded to sort of like standard care or standard plant-based care. And we've worked with keto in our practice for those few individuals, but like a very planty keto. Like if I'm going to do it, it's the bacon wrapped cheese of, you know, of the internet is not at all what I think we should be doing. It should be lots of olive oil, lots of avocados, like adequate fiber, adequate fruits and vegetables. And it also can be done plant-based. I'm just going to put that out there. But I feel like that's less than 1% of the people who are actually curious about keto. And the keto community, there is some interesting research around high fat, low carb, and potential health outcomes. But I think that compared to what is a really interesting question here, because if you have sort of a standard North American diet, which is relatively high in carbohydrate, relatively high in fat alongside it, low in fiber, low in fruits and vegetables, and then you move to a high fat, largely unprocessed diet, I wonder if that's enough to shake up your body a little bit. So you appear to do better, at least in the short term. I wonder, for anyone who is curious about keto, because like I said, 99.9 times out of 100, if someone's like, oh, I have something that I need to do to like improve my health, I'm like, well, plants are going to get you there. And just like a normal plant-based diet, like eat all the plants, please don't go low carb. Carbs are life. But do you see any clinical utility for keto? And what is your sort of response to folks who are like, keto is the way to sort of like improve health outcomes?
For keto, I mean, obviously the medical use is for intractable epilepsy. So, epilepsy that just isn't responding to medications. And in that case, the benefits can far outweigh the risks for anybody. Of course, if someone wanted to do keto, I would really suggest that it be plant-centric, high in those unsaturated fats, low in the saturated fats. Because, there was one study that came out looking at, there were healthy females. I think they might have been athletes. I can't recall specifically. And they placed them on a keto diet. And oh boy, their LDL cholesterol was, or some of them at least, was striking. It shot up so much. And they designed this study to use kind of the standard keto diet that most people are probably adopting. So it was designed in that way to be rich in, say, animal fats. And the level of LDL raising that we saw there, that increase, was on par with potentially familial hypercholesterolemia or like heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, which for those listening means you had one gene related to the high cholesterol, not both. And like you see people having heart attacks at very young ages in that case. So that, if maintained long-term, is scary to me. So again, if nobody is taking anything else away from this, just please don't go super high in the saturated fats. But other than that, I don't know that there's a ton of utility other than, like you said, some people might just feel better on low carb. Do they necessarily need to go full keto for that? Probably not. I don't imagine that it would make that big of a difference. And I think there are potential detriments, especially for physical activity. So we have a lot of trials on ketogenic diets and physical performance, and especially for strength or muscle gains, they tend to be pretty poor, honestly. Even there was one study, at least one, maybe two studies looking at hypercaloric. So these are people eating an excess of calories on a keto diet, which should usually promote weight gain and especially muscle gain, which is what they were trying to do in these trials. And they actually didn't put on muscle. It was like incredible to see that happen on a diet that's designed to do that, just because potentially it was so low carb. I mean, I don't know exactly the mechanisms that would have been at play there. So these are just things to consider. I don't see a ton of utility outside of, again, those specific cases that we mentioned.
Yeah, I just thought I would throw that in there because keto is sticky. Like people are still really talking about keto, and I understand that, when people aren't feeling well and the way that they're eating isn't serving them, they're sort of like looking for the brightest, shiniest answer. And it feels like the most extreme solution is going to be the one that promises them the most benefits. When as a dietitian, I always caution people that whatever you do to make change is the thing you need to do to maintain that change for the rest of your life. And so if you don't think you can eat this way for 5 years minimum, you should not attempt any sort of dietary change that you don't think you can maintain that long. And I think that's where the plant-based diet, particularly now in 2022, becomes so valuable and so enticing, is that we know that it is better for the planet. The accumulated data now tells us that a high plant food diet is also better for our bodies, unequivocally, like almost no matter who you are. And there is variation amongst that. Like you said, like some people might feel better slightly lower carb. And this is not low carb, but like lower carb. I'm over 40 and I know that my body has responded to like changes in diets. Like I need to double down on my protein, right? Like I feel much better when my portion of chickpeas and tofu was larger on my plate than it was like a decade ago, because I just feel like my energy levels are far more supported that way. But you can eat all of these different sort of like adjustments and like individualizations in your diet with like within the plant-based spectrum, which I sort of really love because it's not a diet. It's just simply like a pattern of eating. The other thing that I wanted to ask you, since we've talked about MCT and then like ventured into the keto community, is I'd love to talk to you about omega-3 supplements. So there is a ton of research out there on omega-3s, particularly marine-based omega-3s, so the long chain EPA and DHA. And so myself, I often advocate for people that to start with seeds. Get their, 2 to 3 tablespoons of ground flax, hemp, or chia every single day. That's going to cover our baseline ALA needs. But where do you stand on adding omega-3 supplements like an algal DHA to that mix?
I agree with you that, people should aim to include that ALA, whether that be in the form of flax, chia, hemp, or even canola oil. I mean, that could be one of them. And if you're doing that, I think as a healthy individual, there isn't a necessity to increase or to supplement, say, algae-based omega-3s on top of that. Where there could be benefits, there are some studies looking at, say, cognitive improvements in individuals with mild cognitive impairment, potentially benefit to the DHA there. For EPA, potentially a cardiovascular benefit, but more specific to people who are at risk or who have had cardiovascular events. And most of the studies with the most impressive results are they're using a pharmaceutical grade EPA. So it's not even your standard supplement. That being said, I think it's reasonable as a precautionary measure to supplement through pregnancy and breastfeeding, even through childhood, and you can continue on from there if you like, and possibly even into old age. I mean, I know there are some recommendations around that. I don't know that the data is all that strong, to be honest, and I would love to see a study done on a relatively health conscious plant-based population, maybe Adventist Health or something, where you look at those who supplement versus those who don't, and say cognitive outcomes, cardiovascular outcomes, and see if there is a difference. That's ultimately what I would need, I think, to shift my view, or a really long-term randomized controlled trial, but that's probably not going to happen. So that's what I would like to see, to have a firm position one way or the other. But right now, as it stands, I don't think the data is strong enough to really support the necessity for a healthy person to have to supplement. But I think it's a reasonable precautionary measure if someone really wanted to.
Thank you for that, because I think there's also a lot of fear. I mean, also when you have so many people advocating that we buy their omega-3 fats, I think there's a lot of fear, particularly around that notion of conversion, right? So when we spoke about that a little bit before with the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and that there was some thought that like if the ratio is off, if you have way more omega-6s than omega-3s, then they are going to outcompete and fewer of the omega-3s are going to be converted to the long chain. But you've shared with us that it's really more about these ultimate amounts, like get your omega-3s, and that's going to be enough to drive the pathways. So I hope that helps to sort of like assure people that you are going to get the omega-3s that you need. And same thing in our practice, like we advocate for 2 to 300 milligrams of DHA when someone is pregnant and breastfeeding to support neural development. But otherwise we say, get your seeds first. And of course, if it fits the budget, if people are curious, it's not harmful. I think where my sort of like focus always is does it fit the budget? Because I think oftentimes we spend so much money on supplements when we could just be like, buying more greens, buying more flax, these like really basic staple foods that are affordable. And because they take up a larger bulk of our pattern, that they are having a bigger impact on our overall health. I love chatting with you. I feel like we could chat for so much longer, but we should probably shift into the rapid fire questions now. I would love to know, we end every episode with rapid fire questions. They are a total surprise, but they're also softballs. So I would like to start by knowing, what do you think is the most overrated, like superfood or like concept in plant-based nutrition right now?
In plant-based, I thought you were going to say nutrition in general. I had a million of those. For plant-based nutrition, coconut oil, for sure. 100%. I mean, I know a lot of the Whole Foods plant-based proponents don't advocate for that, but it's a very popular plant-based product. And so I would probably say that.
So no miracle of coconut oil. Noted. What is the best thing you've watched lately?
The Batman. I had to go with that one. I've seen it. I saw it 3 times in theaters and now it's on Crave. So I might need to see it again.
Okay, you saw it 3 times. That's me. I just finished watching it and we watched it. We called it a limited series in our house because we had to take 3 nights to watch it. But it was good. It was like dark and moody and brooding. I really appreciated it. Do you watch, like, are you just a Batman fan in general?
Yeah, I used to sleep with a cape on and then my mom would come in and make me take it off because she thought I'd choke on it at night. And then she'd leave the room and I put it back on. So yeah, I'm a pretty big fan.
I love that. Okay, I want to ask, so with a preamble, for me, I really do believe all foods fit, right? Like the more that we get hung up on fussy nutrition and being worried about black and white thinking in nutrition, the more we get away from like a truly healthy relationship with food and our bodies. But I would also love to know, as someone who is very focused on nutrition research, who is very health conscious himself, like do you have a habit that you sort of wish you could kick or that you had a different relationship in your life?
I mean, with nutrition, I don't really think so. I don't feel that and maybe I'm lucky this way. I don't feel that I'm someone who gets really like hooked on things, as far as food and that kind of thing. But definitely lately, my sleep pattern's been off. I know we were talking about that before this. We were both up kind of late last night. But yeah, so maybe just getting that under control because it varies so much for me. Like, for example, Monday nights, I work late and then I come home and a couple hours later, it's 11 or midnight. And then Tuesday morning, I'm in there early. And so like that is a little bit of a tougher one to manage for me, I'd say.
Thank you for that. All right. This one should be like a definitely easy or maybe really, really difficult for you. But what is your favorite Def Leppard song?
My favorite is probably Photograph. I mean, it's my favorite probably to play on guitar. I love that song. I mean, I've seen Def Leppard a million times. I'm just gonna like kind of chill brag here for a second. But I've actually gotten to know Phil Collin, the guitarist, really well over the years, and he's vegan as well. And so I've gotten to see them a whole bunch. And their new song is Killer. So really Take What You Want is what it's called. So I've been really listening to that one a lot too.
Awesome. Okay. Last one. For everyone listening who is so inspired by your advocacy for plant-based diets and your commitment to the science and really wanting to live just a really healthy plant-based life, what do you feel is one finite, like small but transformative habit you think everyone can adopt to get just a little bit healthier?
I mean, it's not small, but just aiming to increase fiber intake would be, if there was one thing that could impact your health the most, I would say that. But that really comes down to just increasing overall plant intake. If I was to pick on something smaller, I'd say where possible, replace refined grains with whole grains. Like whole grains are so rich in not only fiber, but other nutrients and so consistently associated with great health outcomes, even if you just increase by a small amount. So I would say, yeah, replace refined grains, things like white bread, white flour, white rice, and so on with whole grains like whole wheat bread, whole wheat pastas, brown rice, quinoa, millet, sorghum, oats, farro, amaranth. I mean, you can go on and on. There are so many out there. So explore, try some of those. And I think it can go a really long way.
Yay, team grains. Oh my gosh. I feel like we should do another installment on grains specifically, because I do think that grains get the short shift. Like most people can get on boards with fruits and vegetables and legumes and nuts and seeds. And then there's this little like gray area of grains that I think people are really nervous about because there's been so much anti-grain rhetoric. And even like I was doing a talk earlier here at the show and we were talking about butyrate. We were talking about the microbiome and how important that short chain fatty acid is for like improving the gut barrier, supporting the immune system and the nervous system. And like a core driver of butyrate production is a compound called arabinoxylans from whole grains. Like cellulose fiber from vegetables don't drive the formation of butyrate. And I think like for gut health particularly, people are like, oh, ditch grains, but they are not just a critical, but an enormously beneficial part of a plant-based diet. I think that is an amazing. We're going to set that aside for like a whole other chat. And I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Matthew Nagra for joining me in the chaos, but also the fun of CHFA West. This was a total experiment doing our very first live podcast. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. And thank you so much for joining me here.
No problem. Thanks for having me and keep doing what you're doing. I'm looking forward to the book. I don't think I've received mine yet, or I haven't checked the mail in the last few days. So I'm sure it's going to show up soon, but definitely looking forward to it.
I can't wait to hear what you think.
Wow. Like this episode was extra. Like I've already listened to it a couple of times before recording these notes, and I pick up something different each time. What surprised you most? What was new information? What was old information? Because I know this crew knows their stuff. Be sure to connect with us and keep the conversation going over on Instagram at the Allsorts Pod and at Dr.Matthew Nagra, or in the free Nutrition with Desiree community, which is linked in the show notes. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Allsorts podcast, which is produced by myself and edited by Brian McCalman. We are grateful to live and work on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Until next week, friends, be well.